And we are back, Warp and Woof Radio, RadioNext.tv at the Cool Groove site. We come to you on Wednesdays from 11 to 11:50. Glad to do so. We are sponsored by the Comenius Institute. For those of you on Facebook Live, you actually get to see the stand-up right behind us. And we are here doing crossing three bridges. The first one is in the college arena. I teach at IUPUI, as well as meet young Christian college students, helping them to think Christianly about their disciplines, their subjects, their academic streams of interest, working with not only students, but also faculty there, and great faculty. I have a privilege to be invested in the humanities department there, really grateful to do so. We also cross the bridge into community, which is what we're doing right now, through our radio show that we do once a week on Wednesdays. And what we've been doing for the last 4 years, over 200 episodes, over 200 guests, is having Christians from around Indianapolis who are doing good based on Titus 3:1-8 and 14. Do good, do good, do good. That is our focal point. We're really interested in that. And we'll be introducing you to our guests here in just a moment. And then our third bridge that we cross is into culture. And we do this in lots of different ways. I write and speak in lots of different venues. But every Tuesday, you might be interested in this, we put out something called Truth in 2, which is a Christian truth in 2 minutes. And you can find that every Tuesday morning, and you can actually subscribe at our YouTube channel. And you can also pick us up at ComeniusInstitute.org or at my website, warpandwoof.org. That's WARPANDWOOF.org. Today, we are really pleased to have Eric Cooper here with us from the Stone Table. Eric, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So this is going to be real simple because, it's right before Christmas season, and we're both excited for that. I suspect that what's going on inside of me about that is the same for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us just a little bit about your family. Give us some bio, church info, whatever you'd like to give us.
Sure. So I am married. It'll be 25 years this next year. I've got 3 kids, almost 21, 18, and 14. And been an Indianapolis guy almost my entire life. I mean, born and raised here, spent 2.5 years in Nashville, Tennessee for college. And back here. So we're West Siders. We like to say West Side is the best side. Started out in the business world. Spent 12 years in full-time ministry on staff at a large church as a church planter in an urban context. And since 2012 now, I've been back in the marketplace. And I can, explain more of that, I guess, as we talk more today. But
we'll riff on that a little bit. What church were you invested with?
So I was on staff at Lakeview Church on the west side, born and raised there. And then we launched a city community church in downtown Indy. And so that was a beautiful season of life, now connected predominantly with my brother-in-law's church. He's in Bloomington. My daughter's going to be at IU next year, and so we've had a deep connection with their church. So get down there as much as we can when I'm not out on weekends or traveling. So,
good. Yeah, that's fantastic. I just have this immediate connection to church planning because my kids are invested in that. Yeah. So those kinds of things are near and dear to our hearts. Sure. So we're really grateful for the kind of work that you do. But quite frankly, when you say something like the Stone Table, there might be a little bit of disconnect for most people unless they've read about Aslan. So, why don't you fill us in on where the name came from?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of a regal sounding name, isn't it? So it's a throw to C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. When we and I can back up here a little bit, but the Stone Table launched in 2015, but really we've been doing what we've been doing since the early 90s through our housing company, giving to missions, but then we kind of rebooted and relaunched our missions effort in 2015. And we were looking for, what should we call this thing? What should we name it? And I really wanted a name that, people maybe who are outside of the faith, would go, that's kind of cool, right? But people who really knew the story would understand the depth of what we're talking about. So the Stone Table is the location of Aslan's death and resurrection in the Chronicles of Narnia, and really was a call to us on a couple of levels. One is to never forget the gospel centricity of everything we do, so that everything we do is driven by the finished work of Jesus on our behalf. So we wanted to just make sure we never forgot that. But the second thing is tables are gathering places. And so we are really trying to gather together marketplace people, churches, people from all walks of life to say, hey, how can we all work together to see the kingdom come and to see Jesus proclaimed both in our own communities, our own neighborhoods, and to the ends of the earth.
Yes.
So,
it strikes me to say this because of our concern for the gospel and something that arises on a regular basis on a public university campus, and that is the origin of good. And so when we talk about Titus 3, 1, 8, and 14, I always want to remind people that the basis for those verses are Titus 2, 11 to 14, which is all about Jesus and all about his death and burial and resurrection and coming again, looking for that blessed hope and the glorious appearing, that famous line. It's really important that we emphasize this, and so it's really good always for a guest to come in and say, this is the reason why we do this and the basis for the gospel. And so on.
Yeah, I was just talking to my daughter about that in a different context, but we were talking about that verse. I think it's in Luke. Where one of the teachers says to him, good teacher, and he says, well, why do you call me good, right? And the essence of that was to say, hey, but good originates with God, and so we talk about that a lot, really. That you can't define true goodness without the message of the gospel.
Right. It's got to be a transcendent source.
Right.
This is always, honestly, it's probably 50% of the conversations I have on campus deal with transcendence and the issue of origins and ends. And I think most all of us in a public sphere, let's say, for instance, would agree that we know the consequences and results we really like to see, no matter whether you believe it or not.
Right.
But the origins, that's where we differ. And we differ big time, like diametrically opposed, So that's a big deal for us.
Yeah, I agree. I think the world is longing for the kingdom, but really don't necessarily want the king, right?
Yes.
So I think that is where we separate.
Right. I was just writing one of my Truth and Twos here coming up. We tape them all at once, we do 12 at a time or something. Okay. And so I was doing one on Handel's Messiah, and the idea that, what was it, in 1743, that King George II stood up. And everybody, when you're a king, everybody's got to stand up with you kind of thing. And now, it's tradition, but isn't it amazing? I mean, right before the Hallelujah chorus, you've got that section that comes in the Messiah about, right out of Psalm 2, where the nations will rage, and basically the kings raise their fist against God, and he laughs at them.
Right.
One of the few times in Scripture where God is said to laugh, but it's in derision, and you're right, people don't want the king.
No, but they want all of the goodness that comes with it, in essence, right? Yeah. So again, Stone Table was just our reminder of gospel centrality and everything, that's what drives us, right?
Yeah, that's really huge.
Yeah.
So tell us about this thing about entrepreneurs, because, quite frankly, I don't know, we talk about this, maybe you'll see something on LinkedIn about entrepreneurialism, but do people really understand what an entrepreneur is and what they do?
I'm not sure I understand what an entrepreneur is. I'm in essence living in the second generation of some beautiful entrepreneurial passion of my father and some other people. And so, I always like to tell his story in this context. I mean, really, we started from a housing company, an affordable housing company. So when I was growing up, my dad was an entrepreneur. Tell people he was a serial entrepreneur, which is a lot better than other serial things your father could be, right? But he started out in a CPA firm, probably the most stable, basic job you could have, and then just started getting around other businesses and started thinking, I can do this, right? And so when I was a kid, I never really knew what to tell people my dad did for a living, and so he would. He was in the nursing home business. He was in the restaurant business. He had, a number of different investments here and there, and had sold out of those things in the early 90s and was kind of looking for that next iteration of what he wanted to do. And he came from a pastor's home, pastor's family, and yet he found himself in the business world. And so he and a real estate developer friend and then the retiring pastor of our church kind of got together and started processing, how could we launch a business the business itself we could use to express the kingdom, And then with the overflow, we could invest in new kingdom initiatives, right? But when you're talking about that issue of entrepreneurship, I think that's really what I always come back to. I always told people, my dad, what you have with a lot of people in this world are people who can generate ideas left and right. I mean, people sit around in bed, they write things down, or they talk about, one day I want to do X, or but a true entrepreneur, my dad had this, he just had the ability to go, all right, let's do it, and to take nothing and turn it into something. And so I think we all have that drive to create and to express the image of God that's been stamped on us. But I think they say only about 8% of us, less than 10%, are truly entrepreneurial, And so I'm kind of living in the wake of that, to be real honest with you. But yeah, it is fascinating to see this resurgence, I think, of how entrepreneurship and business development can be used for the kingdom, both at home and around the world.
So tell us about how the Stone Table works. I mean, you've said some things about affordable housing.
Yeah.
We can talk maybe later on about the issue of location, but
sure.
Let's start with what is it that you do? What gets produced out of this thing? Yeah.
Sure. So I'll give you the 3-minute version here. But in the early 90s, so it was my father, a real estate developer friend of ours, and our retiring pastor. Our pastor was retiring. He was going to go into full-time fundraising for missions work. And this was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the whole Eastern Bloc had opened up. All of, the USSR was becoming, accessible really for the first time in a long time. And so he had this passion to take the gospel into these areas. And so he was going to retire from Lakeview. Pastor Tom Pano, he was going to retire from Lakeview, and he was going to head out and start raising money to train leaders, build schools, launch, churches into this area of the world. And so I always tell people we grew up under his leadership, and we slow baked in the Great Commission. We did. I mean, it just, the flags of the nations, and there was a giant globe in our lobby auditorium at the church. And so it was just constant, and of course my dad would tell you, he grew up in a pastor's home. Missionaries would stay with them. He'd have to sleep on the floor so the missionary could sleep in their bed. And so these guys were really saying, well, what could we do to help our pastor? Could we launch a business, in essence, that would help our pastor with his global fundraising, for missions? And so that was the drive, and then the opportunity emerged in affordable housing. So in the early 90s, there was a program that the government had launched to in essence incentivize nonprofits to buy affordable housing from for-profit developers who had built them 60s, 70s, early 80s. And a lot of them had fulfilled their commitments to the government, and they were saying, we're gonna pull out of the program. All these folks are gonna have to move out. We're gonna upgrade the amenities, put in swimming pools, and the government was like, well, we intended these to be affordable, but they fulfilled their commitment. So they started incentivizing nonprofits to get into the business. And so these guys saw an opportunity at that point in time to say, hey, look, we could utilize these programs to start acquiring these apartments, so we can help fulfill a social need, and we can, use our business acumen to actually make an impact on affordable housing here. And then from day one with the company, they said at the end of every year, half of our profits will go back into developing the housing company. Half of our profits will go to our pastor for his missions fundraising efforts. They started that in 92 when they had no money. I mean, literally had, borrowed money on an equity line on a private house to start a nonprofit, just crazy stuff that entrepreneurs do. And, and from day one, they've given half of whatever was left over to the work of God around the world. And so we've tried to continue doing that. So my pastor that I was telling you about is 95 years old today.
Oh, my
Word. Today.
Oh,
yeah. He just retired from our board last year. And I teased him. I said, why are you retiring? You're going to outlive me, right? I tell him the chariot's just going to swoop down and pick you up.
Yeah, exactly.
He and his wife are still married. They just celebrated their 75th wedding anniversary.
Oh,
but just a real hero of mine, as are my dad and some of the other leaders that helped us get this started. But Tom finally said in 2015, even though he was on our board, he said, I think I need to think about slowing down. And he was still traveling. He'd been in Cuba, Spain. I mean, the guy's just amazing. But so we said, look, let's take the heartbeat of our former pastor and let's relaunch, rebrand, rename. So what we started doing with the Stone Table was channeling our dollars towards mission. So it became our missions arm. So we have our housing arm, we have our missions arm. But we said, we didn't want to just give this money away alone. I mean, we want to partner with other people. So we started partnering with churches, with other businesses, and taking our profits and leveraging them with others so we can do more together. So we have continued to be a missions fundraising organization. But then I also wanted to say, how do we serve those people in those churches, in those businesses? And so this whole issue of vocation, calling, theology of work. We were talking before we went on the air here that, I did not grow up in an environment that ever talked about.
Right.
They talked about what we could do with the money, which is important, but they never talked about the work itself. How is the work itself part of God's work in the world? So we said, look, we can continue to raise money, but then we can serve those that we're raising money together with, the pastors, the business guys. And so we became kind of backfilled into becoming an encouragement, an educator, just kind of a champion in our stream for the faith and work discussion. So that's what Stone Table does. We give money to missions, we do it together, we serve the greater church in this arena of faith and work, and just try to push the gospel forward wherever we're at. So
there's so many things to pick up on in what you just suggested there. I'll probably start with this one because my mom's listening. My mom is going on 85 here, and I can just hear her saying to me, see, he's 95 and he's still just doing really good. So, hey, Mom, there you go.
That's right.
My mom and a coterie of her group out there listen to this show, so we're grateful to hear those kinds of things.
That's great.
But then to back up, and I've never heard anybody use the phrase slow baked in the gospel. So that's a whole, maybe we should just have you back on the show another time to talk about that. But I wanted to get to the real issue of what you all are about, which is, honestly, it really sounds like you're developing a profit to help nonprofits. So can you kind of separate that out a little bit for me and for us? How do you create profit for nonprofits?
Well, I mean, I guess for us, it's maybe a little simpler than that. We are a nonprofit housing company, but that was just because that was the opportunity that emerged at the time. We could have done this as a for-profit, but the idea was, to create business for mission. So in essence, the dividend or whatever the profit that gets created, unfortunately for my kids, doesn't go into a trust fund, for them. It goes into, or maybe it goes into a kingdom trust fund. We can have that conversation, right? But we said those dollars are going to be then invested into strategic kingdom initiatives. So for us, initially it was just a way to use business as a way to generate funds that we could give to strategic missions projects around the world that we felt were important to the work of God. And so now we've shifted some of our endeavors. I told you my former pastor, he was huge on schools, training pastors, launching churches. We've shifted into this business as mission arena. And so we are investing in really, say, a lot of the unreached places in the world, places you can't send missionaries, you can't send you can't get traditional visas, all that kind of stuff, but you can go with entrepreneurship, you can go with business development. And I'm not talking about business as a front, I'm talking about full-fledged, real functioning businesses. You hire locals, you're adding value to the local community, and then through those mechanisms, the gospel is channeled. So that was kind of our heartbeat, was to say, how do we create a nonprofit, but how do we create a profit center?
Yes.
So we're in the housing business, right? So we make our money off of leases and management fees and development fees, all that kind of stuff. And so we're using that model, and then we're channeling those dollars both back into affordable housing and into some of these missions endeavors.
Sure, yeah. It sounds like a fantastic opportunity, and one that we want to continue to talk about. We're ending here in our first segment. We're going to take a one-song break. When we come back, we can talk a little bit more about the work and the vocational issues and that direction that y'all are taking. Yeah. You're listening to Warp and Woof Radio, RadioNext.tv at the Cool Groove site, and we come to you on Wednesdays from 11 to 11:50. Glad to do so here with Eric Cooper from the Stone Table in our first segment, talking about what they do and the focus of their particular nonprofit. When we come back in the second segment, after a one-song break, we'll be talking about the issue of work and business and vocation and how everything that we do, no matter what it is for ministry. We'll be right back. Great. So we are still on live, Facebook Live. Thanks for sticking in there with us, Facebook Live folks. Grateful for your presence. The radio section gets cut off, so our tech guy, what he does is he takes what we do on Facebook Live and he reinserts it into an iTunes thing.
Cool.
So later on when that all comes out, you can dice it up any way you want. You can say, take 3 minutes, say, I said this really well. I don't think I've said this really well before, so here it is. Tell a story about your dad or your pastor or whatever.
Appreciate that. Yeah, appreciate that. So you've been doing this for a while.
4 years. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And here's the man right here because he got me into it. So, yeah.
He's so fluffy.
So fluffy. Well, he's just got cool written all over his face.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. You got the little goatee going here.
Yeah.
No, we twins.
Yeah,
I spend most of my time in the south of France.
I'm his white twin. He's my black twin.
Yeah, we're brothers at heart, man.
Yeah. We just think alike.
That's great. When did you guys meet?
Actually, I met him on this format. And the first time I heard him in an interview, I just said, "Hey, man, you need to do this. Create your own show." He was just, because I've been doing it almost 9 years.
Wow.
I celebrate 9 years in May, and built my show off of community consciousness, community awareness, picking the cause, and then let's go deep into it. Most of the time, we're just,
Right.
and we got stuff way under here to pull up so people can help with and understand.
That's cool.
First time I heard him talking about his mission and what he was doing, I was sitting up in the corner just producing the show, and I said, "Man, this cat can talk. He needs a show." And 10 days later, we were on the air.
I was gonna say I like that. I mean, I just walked back in from the restroom and boom, you were talking, right? Like we were ready to go.
Yeah.
And so I think what leads, I think, most of the credibility to what we do is just everyday people talking about situations that just don't get discussed in depth, and people are intrigued about. They want to know more. They want to know more, but I don't want to be. I'm too proud to ask the question. It might seem like a simple question, but if I can sit back and listen, I can learn a lot. So found out that this is a very, very good learning tool and a good way to put information that's not popular out. I work with autism. Yeah, so I'm doing an awareness piece on autism because there's such a discrepancy of African Americans in understanding what autism is, what the resources are, what school do I take my kid to, do I apply for Medicaid to get this one-on-one, all of that stuff. So starting that initiative, and I don't care if the rest of the world doesn't, but man, we got some families now tuned in that are into knowing about this autism initiative. And it's like, if it ain't the 30 people, we're going to turn those 30. We're going to give those 30 people some juice to live on. So yeah.
Well, technology and, social media and stuff's just giving us so many opportunities,
Oh, well, just in the 4 years we've been doing this wasn't even part of our, we were just, have people listening to us on the radio. And then within about a 2-year period, all this video and face, real time, real space, real faces with the voices. Oh man, we had to catch up. And I was reluctant. I was like, they're not gonna watch. They're not gonna listen if you let them watch. But I said, okay, you lose, HB. You lose on this. So go get some cameras and just start, making people be able to see.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, but it's ongoing, and I just love it because it's never stale. I mean, you're learning something new in this world, weekly, daily. We're getting ready to put together some videos. So I just found out there's some animated software where you can actually talk into the computer, and it creates your cartoon graphic that you want by.
My kids love doing that.
I said, I'm done now.
They'll FaceTime me and they'll be a giraffe or they'll be like a cartoon character. That's great.
So I'm out looking for a graphic artist, old school and stuff, and lo and behold, on my Facebook page, Looney Inc. or something, and it just told me everything I needed to know about creating my own cartoon graphic. I said, this is too much.
That's great.
Too much.
That's great. Wow.
Yeah, the opportunities are amazing today. We keep pushing this down the road.
Just to talk to people who are interested in what,
because people are looking for what they want to know about.
Yeah.
Right. Right. That's why today, for instance, when I put this up this morning, I tagged some of our mutual friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I did that because, they know both of us in some way or another.
Yeah.
And in that way, it kind of spreads the word further.
Yeah.
So, Facebook Live will be archived and it'll come out and you can push it wherever you want. The iTunes thing, same thing.
That's great.
But this is internet radio, so it operates a lot differently. It's not terrestrial where you just turn on the thing and it's there. So you really have to push. You have to do it on your own. 100%. Yeah. But, getting people in here from around, I mean, it's just huge. And there's so many good Christian folk doing good things that I don't have any left to talk to. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember who even got us connected. It's just
And we are back, Warp and Woof Radio, RadioNext.tv at the Cool Groove site. Thanks for joining us here today. We're here with Eric Cooper. In our first segment, what we did was talk about the Stone Table and that great nonprofit and what they do with affordable housing and getting money to missions, all kinds of great stuff. In the second segment, Eric and I are going to talk a little bit more about vocation and work, the theology of work, the importance of that. This is just something that's near and dear to my heart, obviously to yours as well. So let's talk about that. Just kind of give us a snapshot, a thumbnail sketch, pick a metaphor of how you talk about theology of work and why that's important to you.
Yeah, well, I think you got to go back to how it started for me. And you got to understand, I've been both in the marketplace and in full-time ministry, right? So I've seen both sides of the equation. But the story I always like to tell, I grew up going to church camp. So I grew up, our church camp was at Lake Placid Conference Center in Alexandria, just outside of Alexandria, in northern Indiana. And, it seemed like every night of church camp had a theme. There's salvation, sanctification, such. We always culminated with called into ministry night. Mm-hmm. And so the evangelist would preach a message on what it means to be called into full-time ministry. And then he would say, who here feels like God has called them into full-time ministry? About 8-10% of the kids would raise their hands, right? And then they would all be called down to the front. And then the rest of us would come forward and we would all lay our hands on and pray for those who were called into full-time ministry. And then we would go back to our seats, like 10% of us called, and the rest of us, we actually would say, somebody would say to me, hey, are you called? Are you called? And I would say, no, I'm just going into secular work, right? I didn't get the call. I just going into secular work. And I don't think anyone was trying to give us bad theology in those moments, because there is something unique and special about the ecclesiastical call to, vocational church leadership, missionary ministry. So, the conversation for me is not about diminishing that. That is a high calling. It is about helping the other 90% realize
there it is.
that they have a call as well. And so I think that was the genesis for me, was just kind of looking back on my life, being both out and in, and then out of ecclesiastical ministry, and then going, gosh, now that I'm back in the marketplace, does this mean that I give up my call, and to realize that really, God has called me to the same thing. I used to work in a church context. Now I work in a business context, but who I am and what he has asked of me has not changed.
Yeah. So this is just fantastic. I have to say, my heart goes out to those 90%, Yeah. I mean, you just ache for folks who think they have no place someplace, and that's just so sad. But of course now, obviously, this is just kind of mushroomed and ballooned and blown up in many, many good ways. So talk about how you approach it at the Stone Table. What are the things you talk about? What are the messages that you drive? Maybe the programmatic methodological process that you go through to get the message out.
Sure. Well, we're doing a lot, with the internet, and I can tell you kind of where we're going long term, because we've got some big plans and some things that are in process right now that I hope a couple years down the road are robust and developed. But we're doing a lot with at the stonetable.org. We've got a resource page. We do videos, vlogs every week. We're just trying to get that conversation started, I say, within our tribe, because it's not that the church at large hasn't had a theology of faith and work. I mean, we can go all the way back to the Reformation, Martin Luther, even before, right? I mean, we can see where that conversation's been. But the tribe I grew up in, which is basically Midwestern evangelical Christianity, I just didn't grow up hearing this, right? And so it was really interesting. One of our church partners had me speak, and I went, and I was just kind of tiptoeing into these waters, and just knew what the Lord was speaking to me. So I talked about faith and work and how God has a calling on all of us, I always like to say, whether you're a brain surgeon or you sweep floors at a local fast food restaurant, all of it can be done to the glory of God and the love of our fellow man. And these people were coming up to me after the service, and they're just weeping. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I say? I thought maybe I had, spoken some heresy or something. People were upset with me. And what I realized was there was just this deep longing in the hearts of believers that feel like that, in essence, we talk about the bifurcated life, right? That we have our sacred space over here and our secular space over here, and really partitioned off, right? Like I use the analogy of the lunch tray, the old lunch tray from middle school that had all the little pockets so that, the food, and it all stayed in its proper place, right? And that's the way we see our lives as believers. And so we talk about that a lot. We talk about how our work has a place in God's great story, how our, the meta narrative of Scripture, that our work every day is actually a part of the great story that God has been writing since the beginning of time. You mentioned origins and endings, right, at the beginning of our conversation. Right. So we talk about the great story. We talk about the great commandment that our work every day, whatever we do, is an opportunity to honor God and love our fellow man, right? And that whatever you do, whether you're passionate about it or you hate it, right? If you go to work with that in mind, you can find, sacred redemption in your everyday work. And then we talk about our work in the Great Commission. How is your life and your work impacting the proclamation of the gospel? So we live it out, we proclaim it, right? And so that's kind of the context that we talk about: work in our great story, work in our the Great Commandment, work in the Great Commission. So.
Yeah. Those are really good things.
Yeah.
The ideas, of course, of this, they're woven, I think, through the fabric of our lives, and we don't even realize it. And perhaps this is the reason why folks came up to you weeping, because, hey, this has been a part of my life, who I am, my work, and nobody's ever said this to me before.
Right.
And they perhaps, to some degree or another, have felt left out.
Exactly.
Yeah. Marginalized.
Yeah, and that their giftings and how God made them and wired them only have a place, maybe, to work in the nursery at church, or to sing on the worship team, or to park cars, which, again, all of those things, I always want to make sure, because I have a lot of pastor friends, right? Like, we're not downgrading those things, right. But 2,000 hours a year, half of our waking hours are spent at work. Doesn't that have something to do with the work of God in the world as well? Right.
I think you said it so well just a moment ago when you said, here's this work here. We just want to raise everybody else up to the same level.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And one of my good friends, a pastor that travels with us and has done some incredible work with us overseas, he had me down to speak at his church a couple of years ago, and I'll never forget when he introduced me. He said, introduced my friend Eric Cooper, and he said, before I do that, I want to apologize to all of you. He said, because it has never even occurred to me to talk about where you spend half of your waking hours a while, right? And so I think there is an awakening, and people are realizing, hey, the marketplace is part of God's work in the world, and it can be a sacred, beautiful part of seeing God's kingdom go, to the ends of the earth.
Right. So, and that everybody can share in that in one form or another is really crucial, I think, for all of us. I'm thinking about my little sister right now. She lives in Denver. She is a person who does sign language, so she's bilingual. She works in a public school setting, and here she is being able to help people transfer knowledge that they wouldn't be able to get in any other way unless there was a translator or interpreter. 100%. I mean, think about the implications of that kind of life. And that's just one person that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And now we have to talk about everybody, whatever it is that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. One of my favorite books on the topic is Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor. And of course, Tim Keller he could expound on any topic, and I would
Yes.
probably read the book, right? But Keller talks about our work as a partnership with God, right? And he says, why didn't God just create streets and buildings and communities and businesses? Why did he just kind of create all of the raw materials? And he says, because it's our job. We were stamped with the image of God, and we are in the world to partner with him to develop cultures and communities and to become the expression of his kingdom in the world, right? And when you think about your work in that context, again, whether you're a brain surgeon or you sweep floors, I had the most beautiful encounter a few years ago at the Atlanta airport. We were flying back. We were on the last flight out of Atlanta back to Indy. It was like 11:30 at night. There's hardly anybody in the airport, which you've been to the Atlanta airport. It's very strange.
That's
right?
unusual.
Yeah, we were sitting at the gate, and we were watching, I think, an NBA game on the screen. We were waiting for our flight, and this woman comes along. She's humming, singing, and she's sweeping under all the chairs, and she comes right up to us, and we're like, do you need us to move? We don't want to be in your way. And she was just so sweet, so beautiful. She told us, no, I'm just wrapping up here, and she told us a story about how she had found earlier that day a bag by one of the seats that someone had accidentally left there. And she said she took it to Lost and Found, but she said, I was so concerned about whether this person was going to know. So she said, I took the phone number off of the bag, and she said, I called them on the phone. This lady sweeps the floors, right?
Nice.
I called them on the phone. So she's just telling us about her day, right? Just as sweet as ever. And she walked away. And I thought, I got to go talk to this lady. So I chased her down the hall, scared the living daylights out of her, right?
I bet.
But I told her, I said, I want you to know, tonight, you partnered with God to take care of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't care if you're sweeping floors or if you're doing brain surgery, right? All of us have the opportunity to partner with God every day in big ways, in small ways, to love our fellow man, right? Through our work.
It's phenomenal, and that's such a great story. You keep mentioning brain surgery, and I have to tell you, there's only one name that ever pops up when I think about this, and that's Dr. Ben Carson. And talk about affordable housing.
Sure.
He's obviously invested in HUD right now, a very important person. But this is what he used to do for a living. The man's brilliant. So that kind of thing, along with your focal point on this lady who was taking care of a bag.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter. I often tell people that I'm really concerned that we have more bartenders as Christians. I think we need more Christian bartenders, because what better place might there be than to have this interaction with people that you might actually be helpful in some sense with them.
Well, it's funny. We're seeing that even in some of the businesses' mission projects that we engage in around the world, because the business models these entrepreneurs are utilizing are business models that are aimed at creating connection relationships with people.
Right.
Business English schools. If you go into some of these countries and you help them learn English, they move up the socioeconomic ladder so fast, right? But in that context, you're building relationship with them. CrossFit gyms are working huge because of the community connections, relationships, right? So beauty salons. You were talking about bartenders, but beauty salons, you're sitting there cutting somebody's hair for a half hour, 45 minutes. Yeah. They tend to open up to you. They tend to share their lives with you. Yeah. And I don't think we realize how the relationships that get created through business, because business really is about connecting people together, right? I have a skill, you have a need, or you have a skill, I have a need, right? And it brings us together in relationship. And there's so many opportunities for the gospel in the marketplace.
It strikes me to say this too, along with your good comments, that I'm thinking about Ephesians chapter 4 and the importance of God has given us pastor teachers. Who is to say that the pastoral ministry of a woman sweeping the floors or the brain surgeon 100%. Is not also pastoral? What is a pastor? A pastor is a shepherd, somebody who leads the flock, who cares and tends for the needs of that particular group of people.
100%. I've told people multiple times over, they'll ask me, how does this transition back into the marketplace? Because CRF Affordable Housing is our housing company, and then the Stone Table is our missions work, right? And so on any given day, I'm on both sides of the equation. But they say, did you have a bit of an identity crisis, right? When you left pastoring and went back into housing? And I thought about that for a while, and I thought, my spiritual gift hasn't shifted or changed, right? The same way I was responding in my ecclesiastical role in the local church, I brought that same pastoral heart to what we do, that same empathy, that same desire to move people along, to care for people. And I think you're exactly right. Those spiritual gifts are for use in the church, but the church gathered and the church scattered, right? I think we've got to see that God stamps us with unique gifts and abilities to be used in our church communities and in our everyday work.
It's also important to also say this, that that passage in Ephesians chapter 4 is gender non-specific. So that is that it's not just men, it's not just women, it's everyone, and it doesn't really matter where you come from in that sense of things either. It's very powerful stuff. I tell people I think I'm up to 169 mantras now. One of them is the Creator created creatures who creatively create from creation. And so our focal point, of course, is it doesn't matter what it is the gift is, but we're constantly creating from that giftedness, and that's just huge for us.
Yeah, and I think to understand that we all carry the image of God Almighty, right? Like we carry His image, but we don't all have the same giftings and expressions of that image, right? And we all have to come together to create this beautiful tapestry of the kingdom.
That's right. And so the emphasis is always one of looking for the need and seeing what it is. Tell us, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. Tell us about the need issue, because it's obvious, I'm sure, that you see things around us or perhaps around the world that the rest of us don't see in terms of need. Tell us about maybe 1 or 2 of those needs that you see.
Well, yeah, let me tell you about one local here and then one global. I mean, just again, from our context, we just stepped into the assisted living business, but it's the affordable assisted living business. And so what we realized, some people that are smarter than me helped me realize, was that there was a huge need for assisted living facilities in the affordable vein. Most people can't afford $5,000-$6,000 a month for assisted living services. So they either end up living with family, maybe longer than the family's really capable of caring for them, or they end up in institutional nursing care, which is not always the best living environments, right? So there was this kind of middle in the market. And so with our experience in affordable housing, we were approached by some people that were kind of blending a couple of programs together. There's about 10 states around the country that can do this, but we stepped into the affordable assisted living business about 3 years ago, opened our first one in Lafayette, and opened our second one just in Plainfield a month ago.
Wow.
And they're called Glasswater Creek.
Glasswater Creek.
So, and again, Glasswater Creek came from, if you look at the map at the back of the Chronicles of Narnia, it's another ode to Lewis, because the Glasswater Creek is the body of water that originates near the stone table. Okay, so that's where we came up with the name, right?
That's great.
But just had our 1-year anniversary up in Lafayette, and my father, who still comes to work every day, can't get him to retire.
That's great.
But he went up for the opening, and again, residents. This one gentleman came up to me, he was weeping, said, "I've never lived in any place like this before." He was living in an apartment that ended up being condemned by himself, had no relationships, and was down to about 100 pounds, had lost his desire to live, right? So now he's put on 30 pounds, rides a bike, stopped smoking, and he's the head of the neighborhood association in the community, right? So you look at that, and you look at the business itself, right? And you say, look, we make money by serving people. That's what we do, right? By adding value to the lives of others. So those are some of the needs we're seeing on the housing side, especially with the frail elderly, and are happy that we have a business model that can speak into that. On the global front, I'd say what drives us is there are 3 billion people on planet Earth that have no access really to the gospel. I mean, there are 3 billion people, 42% of the world's population, that could be born, live, and die without ever hearing the name of Jesus, right? So you want to talk about need, that is a need that keeps us up at night, right? And so when we talk about how we're going to leverage the marketplace to reach the unreached, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 people groups around the world, And so when we realized that the marketplace and business and entrepreneurial development can be used not only to meet physical needs, like I said, we're going in with these businesses and these business models, and we're adding real value to these people's lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they just become a mechanism for the gospel to be preached, and we're seeing that happen in beautiful ways. So I would say, local and global, those are the two things that pop into my head.
Yeah, no, those are fantastic. The issues that surround us really as Christians are, if we truly are given to the gospel message, and it's really important to us, obviously the global issue, we're there, right, 100%.
Yeah.
For those of us who have been engaged in the process of taking care of elderly family members, and, I'm thinking about my mother-in-law who lived with us for 7 years. We were, and to your point, and a good word to use, incapable of caring for her any longer in our home. And now she's in a facility. And so it's nice that it's only 5 minutes away and we can go see her all the time, all that. But, I see this constantly all the time. I mean, here are these people who have no one who cares about them. It's not care for them, but cares about them as people.
Yeah, it's a little overwhelming, right? I mean, we get to see the brokenness of sin and its impact on our world in both global and local contexts.
Yes.
And so it is, and I mean, we put ourselves out there as a faith-based organization, which is always scary because we're far from perfect, right? Far from perfect, but our heart really is to use the marketplace. I think really, in all honesty, good business is just about helping people and adding value to other people's lives, right? We've got this picture of business in the marketplace as, Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, right? And greed is good, and it's just how much can I get for myself from you? Right. That's not what business is. That's what sin has done to the marketplace, maybe. But business is about serving others, about two people coming with less and leaving with more. I think it's just it's what the marketplace is about, and what we need to, as Christians, get back to championing, that the marketplace can be a beautiful expression for the gospel. And, again, whatever you do for a living, it's a sacred thing.
It is that.
It's a sacred thing.
Somebody asked me recently if I could boil down the Christian message. And I said, I can tell you Christianity in one word, and that's others.
Yeah.
And it's a focal point. I mean, you think about what is Jesus said, quotes Leviticus 19, and he says, you love God and you love others, but you know that you love God by your love for others. So, I can see it in your eyes, that your love for God is emanating from your love for other people. And one of the great things, for your family is to see the kind of work that you do, and the testimony, I think, for generations. And then for your dad, it's just so cool that your dad still comes with
it. It means a lot. And, I still got value to add. What am I going to do all day?
Exactly.
Sit around and think about myself, right? I mean, so I think you're so right. I mean, as long as we've got value to add to others, that is the orientation of the Christian life.
Yeah. Thanks ever so much for sharing your testimony and the opportunity to do this. And
it's an honor.
And when we come back from the archive and the iTunes bit, I'll make sure to send that out to you so you know where to get it, all those good things. You've been listening to Warp and Woof Radio, RadioNext.tv at the Cool Groove site. And we come to you on Wednesdays, but for the next 4, we're not going to be. We're going to take a break for a month. Actually, I'm going to be out visiting family, like a lot of you are as well. And then the first full week of January, I'll be teaching on the East Coast. So I won't be coming back to you until the 15th of January, but we're already setting up some folks for that time. Looking forward to the opportunities of a new year in 2020. Thanks ever so much for joining us in 2019. 4 years coming up on February, over 200 episodes, over 200 guests. So pleased to have been doing this for all of this time. And with my brother, Harold H.B. Bell, grateful for him and for his life. Producer for this show, Josh Collingwood, who does all the work behind the scenes. Thank you ever so much for all the work you do. Blessings to you all. Thanks ever so much for this year, and blessings on the holidays as well. We'll see you back in 2020.